Okay, I think we'll just get started. So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. If you don't know by now, this is the Protected Ground series webinar series for the Ask the Experts platform, the team with the Welcome Legal Alliance. Today's focus is on the race and nationality grounds. Uh, Welcome. We hope that this is very informational for you. Just letting you know today's presentation is being recorded and the slides and the recording will be made available after today. So be on the lookout for that. We'll probably try to send out an email to all those who registered. Um, I'm going to present our presenters. So I'm going to be co-presenting with Emily McCabe. She's Senior Staff Attorney with American Bar Association Commission on Immigration. And I am Chelsea Mack. I'm the mentoring attorney for Afghan projects with Vicina. Um, we just want to introduce the Welcome Legal Alliance. Who is the Welcome Legal Alliance? What is this? So it's basically a collaborative project between many different organizations, including the Afghan American Foundation, the American Bar Association Commission on Immigration, Gibson Dunn, Human Rights First, the Immigration Justice Campaign of the American Immigration Council, Vicina, and Welcome.us. And our primary focus is helping to assist not only practitioners, but also clients with gaining volunteer legal access, so pro bono legal assistance in some way, shape, or form. So if you're interested in volunteering with us or receiving mentorship through our organization, or I should say through our collaborative, we'll provide that information as well throughout this presentation. But just letting you know, we're not the US government. We don't speak on behalf of like USAS or anything. So all of this is just the collaboration of many different legal minds. So today we're going to be covering well, let me first start by saying, so our upcoming topics. So this is the second part of the series. We actually did a webinar on the political opinion and religion grounds. That was on April 20th. The recording and slides are available from that presentation. They will be provided along with this link that's in this PowerPoint today. And then our upcoming session is going to be on particular social groups. We are planning on having that very soon. The date is to be determined just based on some recent changes, but that should be hopefully within the next couple of weeks. So be on the lookout for that. And then today's webinar, we're going to, again, be focusing on the race and nationality grounds. So we're going to just do an introduction about what is race and nationality, what is this all about, discussing some relevant case law, and then discussing arguments, strategies, best practices. We want to make sure everyone knows what we're not covering today, because especially in a lot of our research, we know that this can kind of get into a lot of other sticky issues and difficult just analyses. So we're not going to be discussing firm resettlement. We know that that can be a hot topic, especially with nationality. We're not covering that today. We're also not covering statelessness. Those are very important issues. Today's webinar is not covering those two. We're also not going to cover other protected grounds. We just want to make sure of that. We may have a little bit of discussion about how these grounds overlap with others, especially with PSGs. But again, we're having webinars covering all of the different grounds at one point in time. So if you do have a question about the political opinion or religion grounds, you did get a chance to attend the last webinar, please submit a request to our Ask the Experts platform, or if you have one for the upcoming PSGs, you can submit that question for that registration. And also just making sure you know too, the questions. So we are going to try to have a Q&A at the end with as much time as we have possible left over. But we actually have a couple of experts who are currently behind the scenes answering questions in the Q&A. So feel free to enter your questions even now, and they will answer them throughout the time. And we just ask that if you could just add your name into the question or your email address into the question, just so that we can track who's asking us questions, that would be really helpful. All right, I don't think I forgot anything else. So with that, I'll let Emily get us started.
Thank you. All right, introduction to race and nationality. Next slide, please. So before we jump in, we just wanted to understand or have a mutual understanding of the different ideas behind race and nationality. Of course, under immigration law, they are two separate, nice and squarely divided entities. However, in actuality, in reality, they often overlap and intersect in different ways, depending on the situation, depending on a particular identity. So we just wanted to address that. Oftentimes, it can be both race and nationality, or someone might consider someone might consider an identity part of their race, while another similarly situated person may describe that as their nationality. So just kind of respecting the different ways that folks might view the identity themselves, and how that may complicate their legal case, or make it more intellectually stimulating. So next slide, please. Okay. And the, oh, I apologize. Chelsea, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say if you wanted to. Yeah, we both have a lot of insight into this presentation. So yeah, very similar to what Emily said, and as what the diagram shows, there's just a lot of overlap. We've really been trying to dig into, at least try to provide you all with as much insight into like the separation between the two. But I think the more research we do, the more we realize just how overlap and similar the two grounds are. And so we thought that it was kind of important to look at what the USCIS Officer Training Manual has for asylum officers. So with race, something interesting pulled directly from it states that the relevant inquiry is how the country of origin or segments of the population delineate racial groupings and where the applicants fits into that delineation. So it's interesting because they don't necessarily throughout that particular training manual show or use the word ethnicity, ethnic group, racial group, which is not necessarily what's common. I think that many people would just assume like ethnicity goes to race. And so realizing that even looking at the nationality definition, a part of it, they said that ethnic groups, linguistic groups, and groups defined by common cultures are what kind of fit under the nationality ground. So with that stated, we think that both can actually be relevant just depending on the country, depending on the client, depending on the culture. And something also really important to share and to note, and you'll probably hear us say it throughout, is that it really depends on the client. It depends on how they identify. And then also, at least coming from a US perspective, we see race and nationality very differently than most countries and most cultures around the world. So just because I was born in America, it means I'm American does not mean it's the same way for every other country, especially in the Afghan context. And so we just want to make sure that you're very culturally sensitive, especially those who are maybe not as familiar with immigration work, that you really need your clients' input into all of this. You can't necessarily just go based on a birth certificate or based on just your understanding of your own ideals of what, race and nationality, what that means to you. The client is the best one to share that information, and we'll get into more of those details later. But yeah, just looking at these just kind of general definitions, and I would hate to even call them legal, but just the idea of like how fluid both of these concepts are. And I know even with nationality, we did mention that it's looking at like the ethnic group or the linguistic group, not necessarily what country was this person born in. So again, not necessarily just the US focus on what these different terms mean, but really how the client identifies. And I think that, yeah.
Thank you. And building off of, as Chelsea explained, remembering also that both race and nationality are social constructs. And coming from there, it allows itself to be a little bit more, to practice some cultural humility when we have these conversations, especially with clients before we even dig into the legal part of their case. And as Chelsea also talked about the nationality, especially nationality can be seen as something that is, oh, this is the country I'm from, when as we see it, as most or as many folks in the US see it as, oh, well, I'm American. But in a lot of other countries, there are individual groups within that they might identify first. For example, there's a famous quote from Spanish, from somebody in Spain that says, I am Catalan and then I am Spanish. And so that just kind of identifies of, yes, they recognize they're Spanish, but first they recognize the cultural and historical group that they share first. That's much smaller than Spain as a nation. And for the history with race and nationality, of course, in the US, it's important to recognize our own history with race and nationality when it comes to immigration, and it has often been tied to citizenship and who gets citizenship and who does not get citizenship. And I just want to preface this with saying that there are fantastic scholars on this issue about race and nationality in immigration and in the American context. And I am not even close to one of those fabulous scholars, but it is very important to understand the US lens that we are seeing this through, even though asylum and refugee is an international concept. And so recognizing that our history of laws are absolutely filled with racist and xenophobic undertones and overtones. And so just recognizing that and giving that space is very important in this work in order to really try and build better rapport with clients and just have a mutual understanding of where everyone is coming from. And that can, in my experience, that can only benefit you as a person and you as a lawyer, much less in the individual case where it may arise. And so we have, in the US context, we have the naturalization law of 1790 that limited citizenship to free white property owning men. We also have the infamous Dred Scott case that held that formerly enslaved Black folks could not be granted citizenship. And so it's just important, again, to recognize how we, even though asylum and refugee status did not come until much later, these are conversations we've been having for hundreds of years. And the Chinese Exclusion Act cases, also dealing directly with nationality, that were not repealed until the 40s, until the 1940s. So just recognizing our own hand in this kind of conversation historically. And internationally, I'm sure most of you know this, but asylum and refugee really started post the World War II, post the Holocaust, and it started as the legal right to seek asylum created under the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Refugee Convention, which again, the US did not ratify until 1980. So again, just recognizing that history is very important to give space to and recognize when you're having these conversations. And as I'm sure many of us have found out, oftentimes our clients who are not from the US have a better grasp on US history than some of us do. Next slide, please. And also another thing to note is, of course, what do we do if more than one ground applies in my client's case? And generally, of course, we recommend it's best practice to include all grounds that may apply in a case, no matter how overlapping or similar they might be, because that makes it easier for the adjudicator to approve or grant. If they don't like this one for whatever reason, maybe they like the phrasing of this better. So it definitely helps give them somewhere to hang their hat to approve it. And of course, thinking as lawyers, it builds a stronger record for appeal if you have a bunch of different options. And we also want to state that it's very important not to couch everything in the particular social group ground if you do not have to. The particular social group ground is not supposed to be a catch-all, but oftentimes practitioners use PSG in lieu of race or national origin, even when the race or nationality is a large part of the PSG. And sometimes it makes sense to make it a PSG, but sometimes it just really sounds like it might be better suited for example, for a Mayan Icho client, race might be a more appropriate box to check if that is the entirety of the PSG. And just really thinking through the different options that you have so that you're not limiting your client in just one type of category when there could be an application in more than one. And also recognizing that novel cases are not easy for asylum officers to grant. And so if you can give them kind of the low hanging fruit of, oh, look at how nicely this fits in this box, it might make it a little bit easier and more likely that your case is going to be approved. And you can still have the additional ground that may apply as well. And as we know with asylum office grants, we often don't know what was the legal theory that won the case, which is just another reason to give as many as possible, within reason, of course. And we will discuss a particular social group more in our upcoming webinar, but we just wanted to talk about it real quickly here, because the two do not only do race and nationality intersect quite often, but then we also have PSG that comes in quite frequently as well.
Yeah, and I guess one other note about that too, I know Emily and I were discussing a lot about this before this presentation, is just there's a big difference between defensive and affirmative arguments, and like the leeway that practitioners have as far as how complicated those arguments can be, especially looking at like a PSG or a race. So that's the reason why, especially looking at the affirmative asylum office, we're really trying to encourage you to look at other grounds other than PSG, just because I think with the court, the immigration judge may have more understanding and more time to kind of parcel out what you're trying to argue rather than the asylum officer. So yeah, with case law, we just wanted to provide a couple of cases that we thought were relevant. We will say from a lot of our research, there's not as many cases about race and nationality as you would hope. I mean, no PSGs, there's just tons of case law to pull from depending on ethnicity or country or just everything with PSGs. There's tons of case law all the time. It's a highly litigated ground, not as much with race and nationality, which seems to be a little bit more straightforward. But anyway, we did find a few cases. So there in the nationality ground, we found matter of OZ and IZ, which is a BIA case. This was a case where there were Russian natives who were Ukrainian citizens, and basically they were granted asylum on the basis of their Jewish nationality living in Ukraine. Now, this is a really good example of overlap between even another ground where, there could be nationality considered here, depending on who you speak to and depending on what part of the world. The Jewish race may be considered an actual race, or Jewish people may be just looked at as the religion ground and their religious affiliation. So with Judaism. So with that said, we just thought that this case was really important to just highlight where there were these clients that unfortunately, applicants, I should say, who were unfortunately beaten and harassed and discriminated against due to their nationality, which in this case was the Jewish nationality. But it shows that within the country itself, like, it's interesting because with nationality, you want to make sure that you are looking at, not only again what country that they're sitting in, but also does the persecutor believe that they are from another country. So I know that this is a very common case, not only with with this particular case, the case law, but in other cases such as like Hutus and Tutsis in the Congo or in other countries, just depending on the context that that particular client is coming from. They may be considered of another nation, and we'll get into more details about Afghan specific contexts. But yeah, with this case, it's important to, and I know we'll note it, I think, in the next slide, but discussing the difference with like discrimination versus persecution, and can discrimination rise to the level of persecution? And I know in this particular case, a matter of OZ and IZ, the court stated that these incidents constitute more than just mere discrimination and harassment. So just understanding what they went through was on the basis of their nationality, their Jewish nationality. Also, there's a case, Duarte de Guinac versus INS, the Ninth Circuit case, where although this court actually found that the asylum claim was based on the race ground, I just thought it was really important to put it on here because this case is actually notated under the nationality grounds in the USCIS asylum officer training module. And that's because of the use of the word ethnicity and ethnic group. So this was a case where there's a Guatemalan citizen of the Quiche ethnic group, and he was beaten by members of the national military because of his indigenous status. And many Quiche in Guatemala viewed as Indians, and it's a derogatory term. And so the court found that he was specifically targeted because of this particular race. And he received like the repeated beatings, and there was explicit expressions of ethnic hate towards him. And so it's all because of him being an Indian. But it's interesting because, again, the officer manual points out that the ethnic characteristic can also be considered a nationality claim. And that's pretty much verbatim from the officer's manual. And one quote that we just wanted to provide here was stating that this applicant was persecuted on account of his ethnicity, a category which falls somewhere between and within the protected grounds of race and nationality. So again, just showing that even on one of the circuit courts is stating that there's additional case law supporting the fact that nationality and race can actually overlap, that they can be considered both. Again, it really depends on the context, depends on the culture, depends on the group, depends even on the person and how they identify or how others perceive them. Just showing again, that the race and nationality are going hand in hand with a lot of these cases. And with that, we'll talk about race.
Okay, and I apologize for all of the information on this slide. I know it goes against all of the rules of PowerPoint slides, but I just wanted to get some examples out there. So the race case law, and just like Duarte, there is another case, Babala out of the Ninth, that says that ethnicity falls somewhere between race and nationality. And there is another case that is, as opposed to a lot of these cases, that's a little bit not as squared off and nicely fit in boxes. Andresian out of the Ninth says that persecution based on the Armenian ethnic origin was treated as on account of race. So those are more the straightforward cases, and a little bit of the cases that are great to know, but unfortunately, if you're not in the ninth, not the most helpful in the world. And other than that, the big thing, as Chelsea just noted, is persecution versus discrimination. And I put discrimination in quotations because I think it's a little harsh to call it discrimination. The things that are being described in these cases seem to much more fall under persecution. But I am not an immigration judge. So in Sarita, this is good case law in that realm of types of cases, where the IJ and the BIA originally said that the persecution that she faced does not actually, or the threats and incidences that she faced did not amount to persecution. The Ninth overturned that ruling and said that, taken in aggregate, the incidents and threats compel them to conclude that she suffered past persecution. And the real zinger, that no reasonable fact finder could conclude otherwise. And then some of the bad cases when it comes to persecution versus discrimination. There's a few in the 6th, and then in the 8th and the 10th, and the 1st, that basically say that there was no persecution, past or a well-founded fear of future persecution, because the harm that occurred was mere discrimination. So we'll talk about evidence and cooperation later, but just be aware of country conditions and trying to find a pattern or practice of persecution of the group that you are, that applies in your case, because there is some bad case law out there that says that harm, even if it's egregious, is still just discrimination as opposed to amounting to persecution. And then I also just wanted to point out that there is a great footnote out of an 11th Circuit case, that the case itself is not great, but there's a great footnote about how the Mayan ethnicity can be either race or PSG, and interchanging them or picking only one as the basis for the appeal is not important in the analysis, because it was clear that his claims stem from the fact that he is Mayan. So it is nice to know that even though this case was not super great in race case law, that these courts are having these conversations, and that it's not a totally closed book on recognizing the nuances of ethnicity versus race versus nationality and all those sorts of things, and where they fit squarely. And next slide, please.
Just kidding. Okay, it's better to unmute yourself. So we're just going to talk a bit about best practices with arguments, strategies, as well as just understanding, I guess, getting more clarity as far as how do I figure out if my client can claim one of these grounds. So as we continue to state and will continue to state, basically, your client is the expert in this. Yes, obviously, you are legally trained and have understand all of the analyses and legal arguments, and that is fantastic. But as far as being able to figure out if one of these grounds is applicable to the case, that's really going to fall on you getting more clarity from your client. So when considering this, you really should ask your client, how do they identify? Some clients, just from that question, may understand what you're saying as far as like, what is your ethnic group? What is your tribe? So they may say, X is my race, Y is my nationality. It really also helps to demonstrate the a sense of cultural humility in this conversation. Again, for those who are newer to immigration work, if maybe this is your first time taking on an immigration case, cultural humility is really important in this work because you're consistently working with individuals who are not from your country, do not have the same idea or context. Even similar countries, whether other westernized type of countries, are still very different. So just always having that sense of that demeanor of having respect for someone and their culture and their understanding their worldview is really important. And specifically, I know we provided one of the examples of the Quiche ethnic group. Depending on the context, someone stating or calling someone else an indigenous person may actually be offensive and may have a negative connotation. So again, just being very careful with the way that you word things, and just understanding that it's really important to understand how the client identifies themselves is helpful. Looking into how society identifies your client. So if there's any physical characteristics that are very common for their particular tribe or their particular ethnic group. And I know in a lot of our conversations with Afghans, whether clients or colleagues, we do understand that many of them are able to identify others based on the way that maybe they have certain facial features. Also, traditional dress is very important. Maybe the way that they may dress for just regular everyday dress, or maybe for special ceremonies or events, weddings, cultural gatherings, may identify which ethnic group they may identify with. Also, the location that they are in, or their family are from in Afghanistan. I'm learning more and more as the more Afghans I speak with, as long as you're able to tell them, like, maybe my client or this particular person is from this particular part of Afghanistan, they can easily tell you most likely which ethnic group or ethnic groups they probably fall along the lines of. So just again, it helps you get a clear understanding of how society is viewing them, because something that we are making sure that everyone understands that race, although you can just have the race argument itself, you can also have an imputed race argument or an imputed nationality argument. It's not necessarily just imputed political opinion. So realizing that even if your client may be, I don't know, Hazara, for example, but actually they're for some reason appearing more like Tajik or something similar to that, that actually is an important note to mention. And so again, they may be persecuted because they look like they fall into a different race or nationality. And then also considering whether that classification limits or expands their access to different services, whether to justice, employment, education. For example, there's many different indigenous women in different Central American countries who would not be able to have access to police like reporting, police protection at all, or to court because they are indigenous. And so just making sure that your client is very forthcoming with that information. It may take some time to talk to them about that, but just so that they're comfortable in sharing that, because I look like this, or because, I'm from this particular background, I wouldn't even be allowed to access this particular type of service that is actually accessible to everyone else, that it's not like me. Again, it helps build the case. So we just always want to remind that your client is the expert in the room. We hope that you don't take offense to that, but really it's just so important because being able to understand your client's story through their own eyes really helps you develop their case more, which is also why it's important even in going to creating like their declarations, getting that information for the I-589, that you're really using their words that they're sharing, because they're most likely sharing it in a way that makes sense to them from their own cultural understanding. And I think with that, we can go on to the next slide.
All right. And we're just going to go over some common Afghan race and nationality arguments. And this is not by any means an exhaustive list or super comprehensive list, but just ones that we have seen or heard of enough that it's definitely worth mentioning. And so some of the ethnic or tribal groups in Afghanistan, some of the ones that you've probably heard of, Pashtun, which is the majority. And it's important to note that while many Taliban are Pashtun, not all Pashtuns are Taliban, of course, and also that not all Talibans are Pashtun either. So we just want to make that very clear. Not trying to pigeonhole anyone at all, but just recognizing the different ethnic and tribal groups that are common and represented in Afghanistan. There is also a popular video that was put out from a high-ranking member of the Taliban, where he threateningly says a lot of things, and one of those things is that the only group of people who are true Afghans are Pashtuns. And that is a video that has been widely seen in Afghanistan. So that is a school of thought that we've heard pretty regularly from our clients who have had interactions with the Taliban and who are not Pashtun. So just wanted to recognize that that's something that you may come across or hear about. Some other ethnic or tribal groups in Afghanistan are Hazara, and there has been a lot of news reports recently about the Taliban targeting the Hazara people, and that's not very new. It's just that the Taliban have been going after the Hazara folks before the fall of Afghanistan, but of course now that they control Afghanistan, the harm against a lot of these groups are increased, and just recognizing that there are a lot of, thank goodness, there's folks who are covering these things, even though it's very hard to get that information out of Afghanistan for reporting news and all that, because of what the Taliban are doing when it comes to news and not letting a lot of news out. When we do hear reports of that, it's often from very reputable sources, so we'll talk about corroboration in a minute, but those are the sorts of things to look for that we'll talk about later. Turkmen, Tajik, this is also a group that's been in the news recently. And if you look, sometimes you can find maps of kind of where these folks tend to geographically be. That also absolutely plays a role in the amount of violence and the targeting from Taliban. So there's been a lot of news reports recently about Turkmen and Tajiks being targeted by the Taliban as well. Another ethnic tribal group in Afghanistan are the Uzbeks, and then the Kizilbash. And there are many, many more that we will not cover, but these are just folks that you may have heard of recently or seen in news reports, and just wanted to name a few of them for you. And oftentimes not oftentimes, in the Tazkira, which is the national identity card that most Afghans have, or many Afghans have, it does have the ethnic group on it, the person's ethnic group, but oftentimes that ethnic group is directly related to their father's ethnic group. So many times the ethnic group of the mother and father are the same, but of course not always. So it is possible as well that even looking at the Tazkira, it will say one ethnic group, it might say Tajik, but it turns out that the mom is actually Hazara, so the person is both Tajik and Hazara. So just recognizing a bit of the how the documents that your client has might not present the full picture in how they identify and how they've lived their lives. And the as we've mentioned before, as we've alluded before, there may also be other protected grounds related to these groups. For example, a lot of folks from certain ethnic and tribal groups are assumed to be anti-Taliban, and that, of course, can lead to its own political opinion, arguments, potentially particular social group, but just recognizing that having a conversation with your client about their how they identify can also open the doors to, oh, and because I am a Hazara woman, that means that the Taliban automatically assumes that I am not Muslim enough. So then there might be a religion claim. So just keeping an open mind as you talk with your clients, and recognizing that as they share their stories, that other things may arise that you would want to explore with them further. And then also, as Chelsea mentioned, just remember that any protected ground can be imputed. So again, and this could be something as Chelsea mentioned with, traditional dress or certain ways that people present in public. It might be assumed that they come from a certain ethnic or tribal group, and whether or not that's accurate, it could still be easily imputed on them by the persecutor, which is the real question to ask. So for example, if there is a traditional face tattoo that is done in a certain tribal group, not super common in Afghanistan, but just generally speaking, if there's a certain facial tattoo that might not have anything to do with the person's ethnicity or race or tribe, but somebody sees it and thinks, oh, that makes me think that you're from X group, and treats them accordingly and persecutes them on account of that ground, that is something to also consider.
So considering these common groups, race, nationality, identifications, we wanted to just emphasize how important it is to corroborate the story and provide evidence if possible. Now, we do realize that with certain minority groups specifically, it may be really difficult to find certain reports or just information about their existence, but please don't let that deter you from still trying to make the argument. Just because there isn't necessarily like a beautiful like human rights report specifically about this small minority in Afghanistan doesn't mean that they don't exist, and it also doesn't mean that they're not being persecuted. And so that's where basically even like affidavits from others, or just obviously the client's own testimony, as long as they're credible witness, they will be able to explain, what they themselves, their family, those others in their group suffer at the hands of whomever, the Taliban or another group. So it's really important to look at any identification information that your client can provide, because especially like the Tazkira, it provides an Afghan's whether race, their tribe, ethnicity, it could provide their clan or national origin. That type of information can be provided on these different identification cards. Also, if there's any photographs or records of your client's participation in, say, a certain cultural event or practice that is specific to their race or nationality, that can really help bolster their claim as far as them identifying one way or the other, especially if there's a lack of maybe certain identification documents. And I know we discussed this before, but physical characteristics that express any race or nationality identification is important. So and I keep saying face because I think facial features tend to be the way, at least from my understanding so far working with the Afghan population, that's often the way they're able to quickly identify someone. And so making sure that, I mean, you don't necessarily need to take a picture of the client, but just making sure you're describing that. So your client is describing that in their declaration, or you're describing that and highlighting that in the memo, or maybe you're providing, if you found an article about that, just showing how these different groups are identified. Any of that information is very helpful. If there's any social media posts that express um, like a certain race or nationality that would be persecuted by someone, or there would be imputed persecution on their behalf. So whether it's social media posts directly given like or made against your client or to a particular group, or from maybe like the Taliban, or from some other persecutor expressing their views on excuse me, this particular group, this particular race, nationality, is really important. I know Emily mentioned the video that we recently became aware of, and I wish we could provide like more information. Specifically, we're told that it's not actually in English, but videos such as that or information such as that, your client probably knows something like that. That was just a very specific example based on one of our colleagues' information provided to us. But if there's something like that that is really well known, that maybe a higher up official in the Taliban military government has said something on behalf of the Taliban, or even if it's not necessarily explicitly stated, it's just really helpful to look at the actions that are taken out against similar races or nationalities. Also, you can look at education records. If there's maybe special schools for certain Afghans of particular race, or if they're Afghans that may fit into another like nationality group, that would be helpful. And then any other country conditions information that you can provide showing that the Taliban or any other persecutors targeting whatever particular group of people is helpful. Again, country conditions, just as a reminder, country conditions are always helpful in supporting the overall argument of the case. They don't necessarily have to be specific to your client's specific case. So it helps really set the tone for what happens in the country, what has been happening, what is kind of expected from either persecutors or the government. So it really sets the platform for showing within this particular environment, it's very understandable that my particular client would be persecuted because of this particular ground. Yeah, and so with that, we are just going to provide some resources, and we can also answer additional Q&A. I know our experts have been answering them as we've been continuing, but just want to highlight a couple of things on here. So the training module that we have referenced a few times, at least the most updated one, at least that we're aware of, is from December 2019. But that's really helpful just to look at it. I mean, it's really helpful to look at the way that the asylum officers are trained, and to understand, like, if this is the way that they're trained and they're seeing these claims, and that's the way that you can then adjust your arguments to fit into that understanding. HRF, they have a wonderful library of resources to provide just asylum overall. Our Ask the Experts team, we're all constantly staffing the platform, the Google form that you submit questions to. We try to get back within 2 business days with an initial response. So we encourage you to use that, as well as anyone else that you may know, any other pro bonos, someone that you may mentor. Please share that information with them. We're trying to be as much of a resource as possible. Also, Vicina's created many different resources and courses that you can look at and search through. And then also, we mentioned the Welcome Legal Alliance. There's a volunteer application form if anyone's interested in not only taking maybe a full rep case, but if you want to help maybe with just interview prep, asylum interview prep, just prep a client and takes about 46 hours of your time total. We have tons of different opportunities. So please, if you or someone else that you know is an attorney, accredited representative, or even a non-attorney, because we do have opportunities for non-attorneys and non-accredited representatives, we can submit this information. We'll put it in the chat to you all, but we just wanted to make sure you all have that. So with that said, let me see. And yeah, I see the question. There's the slides will be provided. The slides and the recording will be provided after this. And I'll just, let me read this question out to you, Emily, and you want to answer it? Okay, so it says, are you all tying language, DARI, for example, to ethnicity/race or more as a PSG?
I think this is a great question. And I think it would be totally doable to tie language to ethnicity or race. What I've heard from clients is it's less about the language and more about the accent that they have in the language. So even though like it's not just them speaking Dari, it's that they have a certain accent that kind of signifies where they're from, or and that's more of a identifier. But I think language as a whole, depending on the client's experiences, I think that could potentially be its own big kind of potential evidence to help prove it as well. But I specifically have heard that it's more about the accents, but that's just particular to the clients that I've spoken with. And as we've said before, while it may tie into ethnicity/race, it may also tie into PSG. And so I would encourage you to consider maybe both, and definitely exploring ethnicity/race as its own as well, and not just relying on PSG. Unless in your circuit there's a fabulous PSG case that's right on point, then of course go forth with your PSG. But just in case, I would recommend definitely at least investigating whether race would be its own ground as well in your case.
I know I saw a question before that one of the experts actually did answer, but just wanted to touch on it a bit because it was discussing tribal classification and where that actually fits. I'll just say too about tribes, because again, from recent communication with Afghan colleagues of ours, so depending on how someone identifies, even within their particular race or ethnicity, there may or may not be tribes even connected to that. So for example, Pashtuns, from my understanding, is that there are many tribes within that particular classification, but not necessarily for someone who identifies as Hazara. They may not actually have a tribe within there. So it really, again, always goes back to your client specifically, what they're understanding. I mean, they're obviously going to know way more than any of us sitting here in the US without direct communication and access to that information. But just realizing that I know we did mention tribes a lot, but that may not actually be applicable to your client's case. We're just trying to cover all the possible ways that someone may or may not identify. Emily, did you have any other thoughts about anything? Otherwise, unless we get any other questions, we'll probably end a couple minutes early, but were there any other last minute thoughts that you wanted to share?
This was a question that was answered by one of our fabulous experts, but I do think it's a good one. And it's, is there a right or wrong answer when answering race or nationality questions on USCIS forms? And just as our fabulous expert explained, it depends on the case, but the overall, it is better to list all that may apply, and that way you're not limiting yourself or closing out a potential argument later on. And so kind of checking all that apply might be the right move depending on your client's case. And as I'm sure many of us have experienced before, there can also be little surprises that come out during interviews, during the asylum interview, during court hearings. Even though you've been working with your client for months and months, all of a sudden there's this new incident that hadn't been shared before, that they just totally spaced and never mentioned, that comes out on the stand or in front of the asylum officer, that might tie in great with something that you checked before, even if that hadn't been the original plan. So I think it helps in that case too. And the best intake in the world and the best client attorney relationship, there's still always the possibility that something will come up that's new to you, and because people are people. So
I agree 100%. Okay, so I think if we don't have anything else, and I don't think any of the other experts have anything they've shared with us, we are just going to end for the day. So we really appreciate everyone joining on today. Again, if you have any follow-up questions, if something comes up even in your case, even in an hour or so with your client, please send us questions, inquiries through our Ask the Experts platform. That information was provided in the chat. I'm sure you'll probably have seen on listservs and other things, but there are real people behind that platform that really do real research to look into and try to give as closely related and relevant information as possible. Please share that resource. It's a free resource. Please share that resource with any new attorneys or any retired attorneys, anyone that you know. We just want to make sure that everyone feels supported as best as possible. And if we don't know the answer, it's outside of our scope, because it's mainly focused on Afghan asylum, specifically for parolees. But if there's something outside of our scope, we'll probably try to direct you as best as we can to other helpful resources and referrals. And so with that, our final installment of this Protected Ground series will be hopefully within the next couple of weeks. Again, we just had to do a little bit of a change with that possible date. So we'll provide that information as soon as possible. Please look out for that. And any questions in the meantime, please submit them to us. Thank you so much for attending, and we hope that you have a good rest of your day.